Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Gillerman, and I am Senior Director of Foundation Relations on the BU Medical Campus, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. PCORI is the leading U.S. funder of research on efficiency, effectiveness, and equity in our healthcare systems, and we are fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Keisha Kowa, Program Officer for Health Delivery and Disparities Research at PCORI. Today's webinar is hosted by the BU Office of Foundation Relations, BU Office of Federal Relations, and BU's Office of Research. I owe thanks to Brian Fenster and Emma Bononomi in the Research Office for their help in putting this event together. This webinar is one of a series of events we organized to give faculty across the university a chance to learn more about the private organizations and foundations that fund faculty research and social action projects. In a moment, I'll ask BU Vice President for Federal Relations, Jennifer Grodzki, to introduce Dr. Kowa, but first let me explain how we've organized this. Our plan is to give first Dr. Kowa about 30 minutes or so to provide us with an overview of PCORI's grant-making policies and priorities. After that, I will pose a few questions that were submitted through the registration portal. And after that, we'll open it up to any additional questions you all may have. If you put questions in the chat, that's fine too. With Dr. Kowa's permission, we are recording this event, and it will be posted on the site of the Office of Research, so you can refer back to it later. Jennifer.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting us to join you. And I'm really excited about today's presentation and Dr. Kowa in particular. I'm just going to give a little bit about her background. I think a lot of you on the Zoom will be interested to hear it as well. So Dr. Keisha Kowa is a program officer in the Healthcare Delivery and Disparities Research Program at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI. So her portfolio of comparative effectiveness research includes digital health, telehealth, health disparities, cancer control, and chronic disease management. So that's quite a broad portfolio. Before joining PCORI, Dr. Kowa was a social science research analyst at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And at CMMS, she led communications research to inform the development and evaluation of digital health tools and other resources to support Medicare beneficiaries' healthcare decision-making. Prior to that, she was a behavioral scientist at ICF, which is a consulting firm, and she did work there for both the National Cancer Institute and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh, her master's in public health from the University of North Carolina Gillings School of Public Health, and her PhD in social and behavioral sciences from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm looking forward to hearing from her, Dr. Kowa.
Thank you for having me today. I'm going to quickly share my screen and we'll get started. I just have to minimize it to be able to. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? Great. Okay, as I said, thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to talk with this group about PCORI's funding opportunities. I'm going to start with a brief background of PCORI for those who might not be familiar with PCORI, talk about generally some of the funding opportunities we have available, and then talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of applying for PCORI funding. So PCORI is an independent research institute that was authorized by Congress in 2010, and we're governed by a 21-member board of governors that represents the entire healthcare community. We were reauthorized by Congress in late 2019 for an additional 10 years. And we're mandated to fund comparative clinical effectiveness research that really engages patients and other stakeholders throughout the research process. So that's one thing that really makes PCORI unique in that we all of our studies really include patients and stakeholders from kind of study idea fruition throughout the study duration. And we're looking to fund studies that are really answering real world decisional dilemmas that patients face in making decisions between their healthcare options. So as I mentioned, we're really trying to help people make informed healthcare decisions. And so we want research that's meaningful to patients. It's asking the questions that patients have, patients, clinicians, other stakeholders. It's designed in a way that's meaningful and acceptable to patients. And it's really capturing outcomes that reflect the things that are most important to patients and clinicians and other healthcare decision makers when they're making decisions between various options. And so our goals are really to increase the kind of quantity, quality, timeliness of research, really speed up the implementation of patient-centered research evidence. And in general, we just want to also influence the overall research infrastructure to be more patient-centered in all health research that's conducted. When we talk about stakeholders, we're very broad. So for any particular project, you might not have all these groups represented, but based on your question, anyone who would be a decision maker in that and sort of impact that, whether it's patients and caregivers and clinicians, because they're the ones who are directly impacted, or the ones who are making decisions about whether to offer something. So things like payers and healthcare systems. We really encourage making sure you have the right people at the table that are going to help with kind of sustainability of any efforts that were found in your study. Next, I'm going to talk about the research focus of PCORI. So as I mentioned, we specifically fund comparative clinical effectiveness research. So for those who are less familiar, comparative clinical effectiveness research is comparing 2 or more evidence-based options that a patient has. And so what makes comparative effectiveness, this research unique is that each of the interventions being proposed has to have evidence of efficacy. So you're really comparing 2 potential options to see, based on your specific criteria and preferences, which one would be more appropriate for you. And so we're really looking for research that's going to be answering a specific clinical or policy health decision. We have funded a lot of research, and so this slide is slightly dated. I think the most recent numbers on our website indicate we have committed more than $3.9 billion to fund over 2,000 research and related projects. And so you'll see from this slide that the majority of what we're funding is the CR, so those studies that are comparing 2 or more options. But we also provide project support for infrastructure-related studies, including PCORNet, which is our network of networks, and also fund methodology projects that are really focused on improving the quality and rigor of comparative effectiveness research more generally. And we unlike some other funders, we don't focus on like one particular condition or one population. So we have a breadth of studies that kind of really run their gamut. So we this slide just includes some of the top most studied conditions, and then we also have sort of priority populations that we focus on, and these for some of those populations show how many studies we have that focus on that population. As I mentioned, PCORI was reauthorized in 2019. So as part of that process, we developed a strategic plan to really serve as a roadmap for how we're going to continue to work to pursue our mission over the next 10 years and hopefully much longer than that. And at the centerpiece of our strategic plan are 5 long-term reinforcing goals that we call our national priorities for health. And we'll talk a little bit about this on future slides. And it really builds off the work that PCORI has done during their first 10 years, and then really is being responsive to sort of changes in the overall healthcare landscape. And then there's also been an expanded focus on health equity. If anyone wants to see the report in its entirety, it's available on our website, PCORI.org. As I mentioned, the national priorities for health are long-term goals that are really helping kind of shape the areas that we are focusing on. They're interconnected and mutually reinforcing, and they help us, really focus our kind of research funding and other initiatives, and really help guide how we're going to go about making an impact on health and health outcomes. And so again, if you go to our website, there'll be the specific goal for each of these areas. But this just kind of gives a title, so it gives you a sense of what the focus is. So these goals include increasing evidence for existing interventions and emerging innovations in health, enhancing infrastructure to accelerate patient-centered outcomes research, advancing the science of dissemination and implementation in health communication, achieve a health equity, and accelerate progress towards a learning health system. And we really have a holistic approach where the national priorities for health are kind of at the center and help guide our efforts. And then we have different ways of doing this, and different ways of sort of promoting, promoting the use of evidence-based based research. And so in addition to our CER funding, we also have engagement work, and I'll talk a little bit about the engagement related funding opportunities that are available, as well as dissemination and implementation, because we don't want like research to kind of sit in ivory tower, but we really want to make sure that we're funding research that's going to provide really meaningful insights, and that those can be applied in the larger healthcare community outside of the individual research study. And then we also have a focus on infrastructure as well. So these are kind of all working in concert to really help us make as big of an impact as possible. Under the strategic plan, we have a research agenda. I'm not going to read each of these, but I will pause on the slide for a minute so folks can kind of take a quick look at it. And again, this is also available on the website if you want to take a look at it. But these statements represent complementary broad areas of research that we're focusing on. And really from a research perspective, what our framework is for advancing our national priorities for health. And so they help us inform the development of our portfolio of patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research work. Next, I just want to talk a little bit about, more of the details of applying for PCORI funding. So any private sector research organization or public sector research organization can apply for PCORI funding, and foreign organizations and non-domestic components of U.S. organizations are also eligible to apply if they can demonstrate a clear benefit to the U.S. health system and patient-centered research efforts. However, individuals may not apply for PCORI funding. You can go to our website, pcori.org/apply, and it will include all of the funding announcements that are available. We actually just released 2 days ago our 2023 Cycle 1 PFA, so this is a perfect time to go to the website and just get a sense of what the kind of funding opportunities we have available now. And so this just kind of gives a general sense of, for our research opportunities, what the topic areas are. Our broad pragmatic studies funding announcement is our standing PFA. It's investigator initiated. There's a couple factors to be able to apply it. Again, this is focusing specifically on comparative clinical effectiveness research projects. So it's projects that are comparing 2 or more options that patients have in making a decision. And so, but it's very broad in terms of topical areas, but we are looking for kind of compelling research questions, questions that are important to patients and their caregivers, and really showing that the research that's being proposed is a important evidence gap. And often we look at things like systematic reviews or clinical guidelines to sort of identify the areas of research which may be primes for comparative clinical effectiveness research. So for each of these funding announcements, if you go to the main page and click on them, you'll get a page for that specific funding announcement. This is just kind of the top of it for our first one, the broad one. And it'll kind of describe what the funding announcement is, include key dates, and then also a link to apply. And it's a long page. So if you go to the actual website, there's a wealth of information on that page for that funding announcement. But as I said, the broad pragmatic studies funding announcement is our broad one. And now that we have our new national priorities for health, we do ask that studies are aligned with 1 or more of those priorities for health. And in addition to sort of this broad one, we also have targeted PCORI funding announcements, or PFAs. And so for this cycle, there's one focused on adolescent alcohol use and another one on delirium in older adults. And then we also have the maternal outcomes funding announcement is a little bit different in that it's a partner-based approach where research organizations and community organizations are coming together and partnering to come up with a project to address determinants of, health, maternal outcomes and social determinants. And then we have a methods-based one that is focused on improving the methods so that, again, coming up with information that's going to really help the rigor of doing patient-centered CER. So all these announcements just recently came out. After we have a funding announcement, we have town halls, which are webinars where the PCORI staff who are leading that particular announcement provide a presentation that gives more details, talks about sort of what needs to be included for a responsive application, and then there's an opportunity for questions. And so if you go to our website under events, the dates for those are coming up. I can tell you the broad pragmatic studies town hall is tomorrow afternoon. I think at 12 o'clock. I don't know the exact time. I can look at that, but it is tomorrow. So if that is something you're interested in, I'd suggest you go to the PCORI website and you can get information on that as well. And then I also like to remind people that there's other people like me, PCORI program officers, and we're always happy to talk with investigators or potential applicants about their research ideas or any questions they have. And so at any time, if you have questions, you can always reach out to PCORI. There's a couple different email addresses, such as like sciencequestions@pcori.org, or you could email me. My email's at the end of this slide deck, and I can get you in contact with the appropriate person. But please don't hesitate if you have specific questions to reach out to PCORI program officers to ask those questions. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we review research proposals. We have kind of a multi-step process. So first, when we have our cycle open, we first request a letter of intent, where you would sort of in like 2 to 3 pages kind of briefly describe your research idea, and it includes the specific elements in the template of which you need to include in that. At least 2 PCORI staff review each LOI, and a committee of staff members determine which subset of LOIs are invited for full application. And having that LOI helps us recruit appropriate people for our merit review panels. PCORI is unique in that our merit review panels are multi-stakeholder review panels. So it includes scientists, but not only scientists. So in addition to scientists on our panels, we have patients and other stakeholders who could be clinicians, healthcare system representatives, payers, purchasers. It just sort of depends on the types of research topics and who the important stakeholders would be. We make sure that we have that representation on our merit review panels. So for the individuals who are, or not individuals, the organizations who are invited to submit a full application, they submit that application, and then each application goes through an initial review with a subset of reviewers who provide written critiques and scores based on criteria that I will talk about momentarily. And then a subset of full applications who score well enough or based on area of interest and those sorts of things are discussed during an in-person panel review. For the past several years, our in-person review is now conducted virtually, but it's still kind of synchronous in it. During the in-person panel review, it really allows sort of discussion, a broader discussion about sort of the most promising applications, and it brings in the perspectives of the whole review panel. So it's a really helpful to get those different perspectives of people who did those initial reviews, but again, also the larger panel that represents different perspectives as well. And then finally, based on those discussions, program staff recommend projects to a selection committee, which is a subset of our PCORI Board of Governors. And then that selection committee puts forth a slate of applications that is considered and approved by our executive director. The criteria that we are looking for in our applications, there are 6 criteria. Our scientist reviewers score all of these criteria, and then our patient and other stakeholder reviewers score a subset. So the first criteria is the potential for the study to fill critical gaps in evidence. So it's really important that we want to fund research that is really answering the questions that are most important to patients, clinicians, other healthcare stakeholders. So we want to make sure that it's a broad question that is really important to the appropriate people. We want to make sure that the study findings have the potential to be adopted into clinical practice and improve delivery of care. Again, that is the hope of all of our of doing CER, is that it really has an impact for the larger healthcare system. So really making sure there's a pathway from like study findings to dissemination and implementation in the future. Also scientific merit, investigators and environment, patient-centeredness. Again, we're funding patient-centered research. So really it being clear that sort of the question is a question that is important to patients. The comparators, reflect real-world options that are acceptable to patients. The outcomes are measuring the things that are most important to patients. So it's really patient-centered. And then the last criteria is patient stakeholder engagement. As I said earlier, PCORI is unique in that we as part of our research studies, require patient and appropriate stakeholder engagement throughout the research process. And we've sort of found that it really helps improve both the quality and the utility of the findings of our research study to have that perspective really meaningfully engaged throughout the research process. And then on each of the criteria, they're scored on a range from 1 to 9. Something scoring on the lower, like a 1 to 3, has primarily strengths, and there may be a few weaknesses, but they're mainly fixable, like really small weaknesses. And as you go further down, they become more weaknesses and less strengths, and that's sort of the kind of criteria that are used for each of those, or the range for each of those criteria. So what we look for in a PCORI reviewer, all reviewers are expected to sort of apply by PCORI's mission, vision, and review criteria. We want them to bring their unique experience and perspective because it's really enhancing the quality of the review, looking at the study from different perspectives. And then each reviewer would be assigned a set of applications to review and do that written critique of, and then also asked to participate in a 1 to 2 day in-person panel meeting as well. And so for our patient and other stakeholder reviewers, we want them to represent either a broad or specific patient or stakeholder group, depending on the studies being proposed. And then also, again, they're just really providing a unique sort of healthcare system perspective that's broader than just the research study. For our scientists, reviewers, and chairs, we're looking for individuals with advanced degrees in a health or research-related field, who have publications and relevant peer-reviewed articles, and have current or recent funding in a relevant field of study. So that is kind of the breadth of the process for our research funding announcements. As I mentioned earlier, we also engage in other work to really go about achieving our national priorities of health. And another source of funding is our engagement award funding. So we're really always proactively thinking of ways of being able to engage more people, both in the process of conducting patient-centered outcomes research, and then also engage them in the process of disseminating PCORI funding findings to sort of the broader community and the people who the findings are most relevant to. So we have 3 different mechanisms for our engagement awards. The first one is a dissemination initiative, and this supports projects in which communities, organizations are looking to actively disseminate PCORI-funded research findings, or develop partnerships to be able to disseminate this. So this is really working on getting sort of the findings into the hands of the people who are able to use those findings in the real world. We also have stakeholder convening support, which can support things such as conferences or sessions within conferences that are kind of communicating issues related to patient-centered research in general, and or PCORI specific research findings, and really focusing on getting the word out to our target end users. And finally, we have capacity building. So if there's organizations or partners who would be really valuable to have in this space who currently don't have the infrastructure, providing that technical assistance so they can in the future work and be partners in this work. And we also have dissemination and implementation funding initiatives that focus on facilitating the uptake and integration of evidence from PCORI-funded research studies. And so we have a limited competition. So for PCORI investigators, if when they're coming towards the end of their study, if they have evidence that's been found positive findings from their study, and they want to propose next steps to sort of put their findings into practice, they can apply to funding for an implementation phase. We also have an implementation of effective shared decision-making approaches in practice settings. And this could be either PCORI investigators who have shared decision-making related findings, who want to, again, get it out there in the healthcare system, or individuals who are currently using evidence-based shared decision-making, who want to incorporate PCORI evidence into their work. And finally, there is the major research investments, where there's particular topics of areas where there's PCORI evidence that PCORI wants to promote the use of in the larger healthcare space. And so, each cycle, those topics might vary, and then people from the healthcare community can apply to put that evidence into practice in their context. And finally, I just want to end by going over a couple different ways of getting involved with PCORI. We have an ambassador program, so anyone who's interested in supporting patient-centered outcomes research and sort of getting the word out to their community, whatever community that is, can apply to this program. There's a form on the website, and there's a short training that you can take. So if that's something that sounds like it's of interest to you, we encourage you to look more into that. We have advisory panels who actually are currently recruiting for members, and we really tap on our advisory panels, again, who represent all the different stakeholder perspectives. So we have advisory panels that include, scientists and clinicians and healthcare systems and payers, and they meet twice a year, and they really provide PCORI with valuable insights. And so we really take stakeholder engagement seriously. If you go to this website, it will include all the advisory panels, but in short, we have an advisory panel for the healthcare delivery and disparities research program, one for the comparative effectiveness and decision support, decision science group. We have a rare disease advisory panel. We have a clinical trials advisory panel. We have an engagement advisory panel. So if any of those generally seems like something you'd be interested in, you should definitely look at that to learn more about the panel and also the application process if you're interested. We're always looking for new merit reviewers. And so if that's something you're interested in, we encourage you to sign up to become a merit reviewer. We talked about funding opportunities. So, we currently just had our 2023 cycle 1 opportunities open. So please go to the website, look at that. And if there's anything that seems to align with your interests, you can apply. And then throughout the year, we have various stakeholder convenings and events. And so those are always on our website. Sometimes they're on the homepage, but we also have an events tab. So we encourage you to look at that and get involved as your time and interests permit. So I'm going to stop there. This slide has my contact information if anyone wants to follow up, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. And I'm going to stop sharing while we do questions because right now I can't see anybody.
Dr. Koh, thank you so much for that super helpful overview of PCORI's programs and decision-making processes. It's a lot to digest, and I'm so grateful we'll be able to see will you be able to share the slides with me?
Yes, I will share the slides. And like I said, I encourage you to reach out either to me directly or PCORI generally if there's questions that come up, and program officers are always happy to talk to potential applicants, because like you said, there is a lot of information and then there's a lot of nuances. So if you sort of see a particular funding opportunity, you might have questions specific to that. And so please do reach out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I will get started by posing some of the questions that were submitted through the registration portal in advance. Some of these you've sort of touched on, but let's go through them anyway. The first question is, the term clinical effectiveness research does not seem to embrace fully the range of PCORI's interests. For example, one of PCORI's national strategic priorities is to advance scientific evidence for and the practice of dissemination, implementation, and health communication. That does not sound like clinical research to me. Could you comment?
Sure. Yeah. So again, PCORI was specifically mandated to create, evidence, like to fund comparative clinical effectiveness research, and then be able to, and again, figuring out those that like learning those insights of sort of like what are the options, what information can we provide to patients and clinicians so they can make informed decisions. And so again, that's the crux of what we do, but we want to make sure that the information, we don't just learn it, but it sort of goes out there. And so that's why once we have those learnings of, you have option A, option B, sometimes you learn they're the same, or one's better, or one's better under this circumstance. We want to make sure to get that out there, and that when we learn about evidence that is effective, that it gets out there. And so our dissemination and implementation work is seeking to get the insights that we learned from PCORI funded research into the larger healthcare system. Similarly with there's comparative effectiveness research that is focused on different like shared decision-making models, and then different things. So it all kind of does fall into sort of the we do like patient-centered outcomes research, comparative clinical effectiveness, and sort of it all aligns in that.
Uh-huh. Is communication itself something that you study? In other words, would you study the comparative effectiveness of different communication strategies? There's so many people
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
met recently who are concerned with information sharing regarding vaccines and so forth.
Yes, we do have, yes, and that is an area. And if you go on our website, we also have the portfolio of like all the studies that we fund, and we do, and that's the thing, we do comparative effectiveness research. So you have to be comparing two things, but those could be communication strategies, they could be implementation strategies, and so it is just that we have that comparative factor. But yes, we are inclusive of that as well.
That's great. Okay, second question. You have programs that are content focused and programs that focus on methods. However, I question whether methods can be studied in a vacuum. Won't there always be medical content of some kind? How does an applicant know whether a project is more suited to one of the content-focused programs or one of the method-focused programs?
That's a good question. I think it really is focused on what your kind of primary research question and aims are. So
Mhm.
if you're looking, for example, like, I, want to compare A to B and see which one is more appropriate for like X population, that's going to probably be one of the more like content based. But if you are interested in sort of coming up with ways of, measuring a certain thing, or you're like, for example, like stepped wedge, something we're currently not encouraging for method, but historically we've had a lot of like work in the methods area around like a stepped wedge approach. So if you're really focused on sort of the methodology, I mean, often in those studies, like you said, yes, you're going to need content to test things out or try things out, but the focus really is on the methodology and how you can sort of generalize that more than it would be more of a methods focus. And like I said, I'm going to probably sound like a broken record, but if you're not sure and you have an idea, please reach out to PCORI, because that's a thing we do too. If you email us and you're like, I have this research idea, even within the content specific one, sometimes someone's like, oh, there's, two announcements that seem like they can fit, and we're happy to have a discussion with you
I
to
see.
talk about the what might be the best fit for your research.
Terrific. That's very helpful. Fourth question. In the guidelines for the broad programmatic studies program, you list changes from prior RFPs. Such as adding PCORI's 8 theme topics. Can you provide some color to these changes and talk about how they will influence your evaluation of applications in the 2023 cycle?
So the main changes to BPS have been done to align with our new national priorities. And so you'll see, and I actually encourage anyone who's interested in BPS, and again, BPS is our standing investigator-initiated funding announcement. There's 3 cycles throughout the year. We sometimes have minor changes in terms of like, we'll say, hey, this is an area of interest. Again, it's not narrowing it just to that, but it might be like something came up and we're like encouraging applications in this area, but we accept it in different areas, and you'll see that from the kind of breadth of areas. So I suggest that there's a town hall tomorrow that I would really encourage you to go to, where there's going to be a lot of information about the PFA and an opportunity for question and answer. So I encourage you to go that. And with that mechanism, like I said, you can start, it might be an idea where you're like, oh, I think I want to do it, but I might not be ready to submit an LOI by February 7th, which is the current deadline. But that's one where it's coming again for cycle 2 and cycle 3. So you have opportunity to start preparing and having those discussions and finding your collaborators and getting stakeholder input. And you can start that now. But again, the integration of the national priorities and the themes has been to sort of like encourage work that is going in the direction of our national priorities of health. Every idea has to be connected to at least one national priority. And again, happy to, if people have specific ideas, can talk about how that does. The topic themes are, again, areas where we're interested in getting information, but they're not limiting. So if you look at the PFA, it says like, if there's one of the topics that your study aligns to, would it, check it off. But if not, there's another category, and you're not, it's not going to impact your evaluation because you didn't fall into one of those categories.
I see. That's great. Good to know. Let's see. Does PCORI fund epidemiological research?
unless it's, is there a specific example that someone would have? Because
It was me who asked that question, Dr. Coe. Thanks for a great presentation. You know, some of our faculty members are focused on data about clinical provision, and they're not necessarily meeting with live patients. Does PCORI fund studies that are really data driven?
I think the question would be like, is there a comparison that you're making, right? Because we do have studies that are kind of more like natural experiments, and you could potentially use like claims data or something like that. So it's not, you don't necessarily have to be talking to live patients, but you have to make it clear what your comparisons are, and then also what the sort of what the question is that you're answering and how that's going to help patients in their decision making.
Great, thank you. There were a couple of questions about whether regarding sort of career stage. I'll just read them all together because they're all related. Does PCORI have programs that are exclusive to a specific career stage? Another person asked, I'm not at a stage in my career where I can manage a $20 million grant. How big a study cohort? How big does a study cohort have to be considered big enough for PCORI? Should I wait until I'm ready to manage a huge grant before applying?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. I mean, PCORI definitely is, we're always trying to come up with strategies to kind of, build people's capacity to do work. I mean, we do have like the Placer initiative, which I think is probably what the person's talking about, is our phase large, initiative is like our huge studies where you have to document that. And so I wouldn't say there's a particular stage, but you do sort of need to demonstrate that you'd be able to, you have the experience to manage the level of the study that you are proposing. And not all PCORI funding, I mean, they have to be at a certain level, but they're not all $20 million studies. And I will say sometimes when there might be a PI who has less experience, sometimes you can sort of like collaborate with a more experience. We have like co-PIs and dual PIs. So I think there might be different strategies, but again, given, the expectation of the research, the PI and the research, you're going to have to demonstrate that the investigative team generally is able to sort of do because it is a large scope like research that's being proposed.
Great. Here's a question in the chat. Is there a PCORI funding opportunity related to planning for a future large-scale comparative effectiveness study, e.g., identifying optimal patient-centered outcomes for future study in an RCT?
Those our engagement studies often seek to do that. So if there's there's in the engagement awards, there or sometimes you're building collaborative so that collaborative could do future research together, or you're setting a research agenda. I have a study in my portfolio where the investigator first had an engagement award, developed kind of a multi-stakeholder group, and then that group really was central to sort of creating the research question, helping design the research study that she later applied for and was funded. So I'd say I think the engagement awards are a good place to look when you're sort of trying to build that capacity, or come up with or even like get the right players together to figure out what are the most important research questions in your specific area.
Okay, I guess a related question is there a threshold number of members in the study cohort that PCORI looks at? I mean, is there a minimum, say?
There's not a minimum, but for your question, you're going to have to be powered at a certain level. Yeah. So depending on your question, sort of that's going to dictate your sample size.
Okay, fine. Okay, so the one more question, the last one I can see, is how do you measure the impact of your grants? I think that probably a related question underlying this one is, could you talk about the reporting requirements for PCORI?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a whole evaluation group that works collaboratively, kind of leads our evaluation efforts, but they work, with across PCORI. And so we consider ourselves a learning organization. And so the evaluation team works really, from the beginning to sort of like track with those, what we're, first kind of monitoring like what we're doing early stages. Now that we're kind of growing as an organization, starting to look at outcomes and stuff. So we do have a strategy. I have to double check to see if it's like what exactly is available online, and I'm happy to share that. But we are definitely looking we do look holistically to sort of understand sort of the impact that PCORI research is making. We do things like engagement's a big part of what we do. So there's a lot of work with like looking at engagement and how that has impacted the studies that PCORI engages. And so for our research studies, we have different, so they kind of, do like some standard, they're called interim progress reports, like every 6 months kind of do a report, and there's kind of a standardized template where you kind of track like, how your study's going, what barriers you're facing, that includes things, what's being done to help with retention, what are your engagement things, and tracking all that stuff. So we do have kind of reporting mechanisms for all of our studies. And then that's in a place where, our evaluation folk, we can sort of look holistically across our work to look at that. And then in every study, at the one of the last things, they have to do a final research report that becomes publicly available on PCORI. That is like a 15,000 word report that includes all the details of like what the study was, what the findings were. And so that becomes available as well. So there's a wealth of information on PCORI.org that anyone can take a look at if they were interested in that as well.
Okay, we talked before we went live, Dr. Ko, about success rates, and you said you didn't have them on hand, but that you would look them up.
I will look to see like what we have. Yeah. And it's probably going to like vary. I'm not sure exactly what's publicly available, but I can definitely look and get back to you on that.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Okay. Other questions? Anybody should feel free to just speak up and raise your hand. I can't see everybody's hands, so you'll have to just speak up. Okay, well, we have more time, but I guess we don't need to use it all. Thank you very much, Dr. Koa, for giving us your time and sharing your knowledge of PCORI with us. This is hugely informative.
Thank you.
I want to remind all the faculty who attended that the Foundation Relations staff members are standing by to assist you with your applications to PCORI. You can find us at bu.edu/foundations. We can provide summaries of all new PCORI's new RFPs, checklists of the application requirements for each RFP. We can also assist you with the preparation of proposal narratives, and we can connect members of the medical school faculty with the school's Office of Proposal Development, which provides expert assistance in the preparation of budgets and timelines. And if there are no further questions or comments, I'd like to thank Jennifer, Brian, and especially Dr. Koa for your participation in this webinar.